CTO of Polychain Capital. I'll hand it off now.
All right. Everyone, how's your conference so far? Cool. Hi, my name is Abhi, and I'm the CTO at Polychain. And in my previous lives, I was a founding engineer at two Web2 startups, so I deeply care about security. And yeah, I built one of the first container security products in the market, and I've been doing this for the past 15 years. And the intersection of crypto and security is extremely near and dear to my heart. It is what keeps our funds safe. It's what keeps our users safe, and that is what is gonna kind of make sure that we're not on the bad side of all the regulators as well. So without further ado, so yeah, we have a lot to cover today, and today's talk is aimed at founders, at policymakers, and at OPSEC teams to kind of better defend, to have better preparation strategies to defend our TVL, protect our users, and essentially prevent from bad actors from wreaking havoc into national interests. So first, let's look at who our sophisticated adversary is. So when we think about modeling a persona who is a very sophisticated adversary when it comes to crypto hacking, right, we feel that that is somebody who's capable of executing very advanced attacks and somebody who's deeply motivated in making sure that your chain is wrecked. And of course, they're all well capitalized as well. So now that we have a persona of the hacker, so let's look into the crypto's nation-state problem by the numbers. So the recent Chainalysis crypto crime report kind of documents how nation-states have been active within the crypto industry, and in this case, we're just focusing mainly on the DPRK-based groups. So they are known as Lazarus or APT38 under darknet markets. So the claim to fame that Lazarus first had was in 2017 with a ransomware called WannaCry. Back then, they were just trying to trick some users into sending their Bitcoin. So over the years, you kind of see that they're escalating their attacks, becoming more crypto native, and from just doing malware and ransomware, they're now escalating their attacks into successfully breaching centralized exchanges, breaching DeFi protocols, and bridges, right? So you kind of see how they're elevating their attack tactics and their capabilities in this process. So if you look at this graph, we are kind of it's an easy thing for us to think that as long as the amount stolen that is kind of on the downward trend, we should be safe, right? But the problem with this approach is that we still see an escalated number of hacks, or at least attempts at brute forcing your users, at brute forcing your protocols. So that, the red graph is what kind of keeps me up at night. So when we want to understand how do we kind of do the threat model, so one thing that I want to call out in this audience is that it is humanly impossible to evaluate all threats, right? So what we need to move is from a threat-based modeling to a risk-based modeling. So in my mind, risks are your contextualized and credible threats. So one thing that we want to move in terms of understanding the risk is we want to move away from just treating the smart contract audits as a catch-all protection for your protocol, right? So I mean, to kind of make absolutely sure, I do believe that smart contract audits are a necessary thing in this ecosystem, but they're not sufficient, and that is the argument that I'm going to make today. So if you want to look at the typical attack surface of any crypto firm, right? So on the right, we have just the smart contract side vulnerability, and we start moving left. We have 0 days, attackers trying to DOS your front end, attackers trying to DOS your infrastructure, and private key compromise, DNS compromise, account takeovers, and they're just going to have a field day with the left side of this attack surface, right? And your smart contract audits is just going to cover a tiny portion of your attack surface, and the worst thing that a lot of protocol users and founders and teams kind of see that if there is a smart contract audit, it means that everything is good. I'm free to interact with that, right? So that approach has led to a lot of problems in the ecosystem that we see. So now I'm going to talk about some case studies about the biggest hacks that DPRK or APT38 group conducted. So these are your Ronin bridge hack for about $624 million, Harmony and Atomic wallet hacks for about $100 million. So a good way to visualize these attacks are essentially understanding something we like to call a kill chain model. So a kill chain model in cybersecurity is what helps you understand a campaign from beginning to end. right? Like modeling these attacks after a kill chain model will help us to understand the motivations, help us to figure out what the attacker is actually looking forward to. And when you think about kill chain, if you disrupt a single one of these steps, you have one by default. So the first vector that we want to talk about for Ronin is essentially to kind of like get everybody on the same page. So Ronin was compromised because of bad threshold management. So 4 of the 5 of 9 multisig partners were on the same team, and they had an unrevoked approval for somebody signing on their behalf. That was SkyMavis validator. And for Harmony, it was just boiled down to like bad key management practices. When with Atomic Wallet, the team has not disclosed anything, and at least OSINT kind of like points to a node compromise that Atomic team was running. Right? So the first thing that an attacker or a sophisticated attacker would do is something we like to call a recon phase. Right? They're going to look at both your on-chain and off-chain data to enumerate your team structure to kind of like understand where your weaknesses lie. Right? So a typical example of that is to like look at LinkedIn. A typical off-chain example for that is to look at LinkedIn and understand who your elevated access persons are within your organization. Right? So these are usually your crypto founders, your exec teams, your DevOps and sysadmins. Right? Because if they were to compromise credentials of any of these elevated access people, they could the likelihood of them mounting a successful attack increases significantly. So an example of on-chain recon is to kind of like understand where your contracts are deployed and see who your active wallets are, and essentially try and basically do what the investigators try to do after in order to try to catch the hacker. The attackers try to do it before the hack, right? So when they're aimed with this piece of knowledge, the next step that they do is something we call like weaponization and delivery, right? So in this, all they need to do is just have a targeted attack surface at one of the individuals and keep sending phishing emails. And all it takes is just one click, one download, one installation of the malware, right? So a typical channels for people to deliver backdoor malware is still predominantly through phishing sites. And the attackers are kind of like getting more and more sophisticated in this approach, right? Like we have seen attacks ranging all the way from offering a job versus like, hey, here is a crypto tool aggregator that you would want to use to make sure that like you can see whether you have missed any airdrops, right? It would be as simple as that. It always masquerades as something that is useful for you. So be aware of phishing and attack vectors there. So in case of APT38's malware, so what they engineered is something called as they call it like apple juice. So the malware kind of like has shown up in multiple in multiple areas, masquerading as a price aggregator, as an airdrop claiming software. So that is the weaponization and delivery technique that they use. And next, when you have successfully weaponized and delivered a malicious payload to your unsuspecting user, the next thing that they do is want to like exploit and install, right? In this phase, the attackers usually carry out a 3-phase attack on your infrastructure, right? So the first thing, like the first thing that they detonate is not the actual malware. It looks and feels exactly like a benign software. So with that, they would have a backdoor to install something called as droppers. So these are the droppers which actually talk back to the attacker and kind of like give control over your systems, where the attacker can keep rotating droppers to evade and mitigate any of the blue team strategies. So and then once that is taken care of, basically now what they do is basically called like command and control. So now they essentially have an entire control of an elevated person's laptop, infrastructure. So it allows them to like freely move within your network and infrastructure to see like where your crown jewels are. And with that, so the specific objectives with the Ronin hack was to access SkyMavis validator and compromise them. With Harmony hack was essentially to subvert the threshold. They had a 2 of 3 signing threshold, and 2 of them were like hot wallet keys, which were on employees' laptops. And the third, Atomic Wallet, it is still undisclosed. The team is not ready to share anything. They have not shared anything there, but OSINT kind of like points that it was basically a node compromise and exploiting various wallet tool generation software. So with that, of course, it paints a very scary picture, right? So what do we as defenders have? Like, how do we want to think about mitigating some of these attack vectors? So we want to think about in terms of like 5 main areas to focus. So it's basically a prevent, detect, forensicate, contain, and recover. So talking about prevent, so there is an old adage in security, right? So the more you sweat and prevent, the less you bleed and contain, right? This has the most bang for your buck in terms of like where you as a protocol founder need to focus, right? So having things like, in most of the cases, your crown jewels are your private keys, like making sure that they never leave an online, never leave an air-gapped machine is like one good mitigation against that. And being like very ruthless about enforcing 2FA everywhere is also, like, I know this feels obvious, but you'll be surprised how many protocols, teams, and products out there do not enforce 2FA on their platforms. And also one other thing that you can think about in terms of prevention is essentially having a good, rigorous OPSEC hygiene, right? What do I mean by that? Being thorough in your patching discipline, being thorough in your secure software development lifecycle hygiene, and essentially enforcing what we like to call signed execution policies, right? So what do I mean by that? If there is a piece of code that runs on your infrastructure, it needs to be cryptographically signed and reviewed to kind of like make sure that like we verify the provenance of these images, right? And with the latest XZ backdoor and the amount of like software supply chain security breaches are on the rise, and it kind of like makes it extremely difficult for you to like monitor where your software dependencies are coming from. And as always, like, educate your users on phishing and conduct like proactive war games to understand how do you kind of like deal in a typical attack scenario. So once you do the prevent, the next thing is to figure out like how do you detect if there is a breach in your network. The first thing that I would always recommend for founders building in the space is make sure that like you have very strong endpoint protection software and actually work with like CISA advisories is a great place for you to know how a lot of these nation state actors are thinking about subverting your infrastructure, right? So they actually give you advisories on here is the malware hash, here is the IP addresses that they're coming from, and they give anything and everything for you to attribute some of these attacks. So keeping abreast of those advisories is a great detection step for you. And also when you set up your infrastructure and network and security stack, always be on the lookout for hunting all of your malicious and anomalous behaviors from your network. And one other high recommendation that I have is also to set up context-aware application and identity proxies. So what do I mean by that? So if a user logs onto your platform, if it is a centralized front end, or if like any of the third-party vendor software that you use, every single user action needs to be logged and kind of like reviewed on a periodic basis to see whether everything looks good or not. Now, the fun part of this is essentially figuring out like how do you forensicate if there is an active breach. So the first thing that I recommend here is make sure that like you have two sets of contacts listed. So one is whenever you list your token, make sure that like you have a compliance contact from that exchange and a law enforcement contact, because the last thing that you would want to do is to figure out this under an active threat. So make sure that like this is already taken care of even before your TVL skyrockets, right? And anytime you kind of like start forensicating things, always be on the lookout for capturing any forensics information. This could be your IP addresses that attackers are trying to log in from, the files that they're trying to touch, and essentially like having a good monitoring system there is gonna work wonders. And another underestimated a toolkit in doing good forensics is essentially using OSINT to be able to correlate on-chain and off-chain data that you have. Because when you think about like disrupting an attacker though, right? Like in most of these cases, it kind of like feels great to figure out like who's the criminal behind it and have them like behind bars. But in most of the cases, that is not an outcome that happens, right? So in any time you make sure that like you are forcing the attacker to deviate from their covert strategies, you have one. Anytime you kind of like collect attributable evidence against them, you have one. Because the last thing that an attacker wants to do is deviate from their strategies, because they don't want to risk attribution. And the third part is, or the last one other thing is also figuring out like once you have detected and forensicated, how do you contain and make sure that like the attacker doesn't move laterally within your org, right? So if you kind of like go back to the original kill chain model, anytime there is a dropper or anytime there is a malware that is actively trying to figure out what your crown jewels are, right? So the biggest advantage the attacker has in the scenarios is to kind of like freely move through your network. The more barriers that you put for that free movement, the less likelihood that the attacker is actually going to discover where your crown jewels are. And also it goes without saying to enforce 2FA on all production accesses, and as a good hygiene, rotate credentials every often and review any of the IAM access to see whether you've configured everything with the least privilege settings that you can. And the last part in this is the most fun part of it, where you essentially change your role from being a defensive to kind of like you go all out on the offense. So some ways to kind of like mount an offensive attack is to kind of like create breadcrumbs and honeypots. The goal is to basically disrupt the attacker's methods and attribute the attacker's method. If you're able to do both of this, it's great. And even one of this is also great. And as a last, one thing that I also want to call out is always partner with your compliance and on understanding like what your effective disclosures look like. Anytime there is a substantial hack, the best case scenario is that you're going to lose users, and the worst case scenario is that you're going to have criminal and civil liabilities against you for the lack of disclosures, right? So I would recommend get ahead of this if at all you get breached. So make sure that like you work with your compliance and understanding what your effective disclosure policies look like. And this is one of my favorite posters that NSA declassified, talking about like how do you want to think about security, and I just thought it would be cool to share. And with that, I want to leave all of you guys with one thought. We know that protecting crypto, protecting TVL, protecting tokens from all the bad actors is inherently an asymmetric game, right? So you are kind of like fighting not on a level playing field, meaning that the defenders have to defend against everything, and attacker has to get just one end. So sorry for painting such a grim picture, but the advantage that defenders have is that we don't have to like work in shadows. We can openly collaborate and share intel and make sure that like we educate the teams, educate the policymakers, and every stakeholders we have. I actually gave this entire prompt to paint to kind of like DALL-E to generate like what does it look like being a defender in this space, and that's what it generated. So yeah, I think I finished early in my talk. So yeah, happy to take any questions if you have. Yeah.
Many of the points you raised make sense. They seem very general and sort of a cyber 101, not just which aspects of what you said is specifically.
Great question. So specifically for crypto, what we want to look at is essentially understanding what does defense in depth look like for actually protecting your keys, right? So things like for example, like one thing that I highly recommend in this space is to make sure that like your infrastructure is protected from side channel exfiltration, right? So anytime you're doing key generations, anytime you're interacting with chains, make sure that you do like offline signing for that. And specifically on crypto, specifically on the forensic side of things, what I highly recommend is essentially using OSINT type tools to figure out like who your attacker is and essentially attribute the attacks to specific orgs. Yeah, yes?
Do you have an example of...
Sorry.
Could you give an example of what you would consider best-in-class response to a hack that you've seen take place over the last couple of years in crypto? What would be that case study?
Great question. So I would say specifically in crypto, like attributing to Lazarus for both KuCoin as one of the best responses there, right? So the advantage, like the reason why I feel that way is that if you like in most of these cases, attribution is very hard, and in case of KuCoin and even in Ronin Bridge, they were able to like attribute it to Lazarus. I would say that's the best outcome or best response that people
Not
have.
just getting your money back, but also attributing to the hackers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of what you talked about was, general cyber hygiene. I'm curious in like that you get into a philosophical situation where it's like take like Blast for example, right? Where then you have an exploit. Now the question is do you roll back a chain or do you need some type of mechanisms to actually restrict flow of funds on what some people might say is decentralized infrastructure? That being said, a lot of them have very, very centralized executions or even centralized ownership. So I'm curious on like how you think about the framing of that, because this is all before. But in the case of an incident response, it's not just reporting, but there's usually some of them behoove some type of response, right? When you actually think about flow of funds.
Right, great question. So to give you like one example, what I'm like happy about is usually when protocols evolve, right, they kind of like move from centralized admin control to like DAO-based admin controls, right? Say to cite an example, like Uniswap has done fundamentally a great job at making sure that how this works, right? So I would say like when you're designing protocol, and especially when before you're comfortable or before you have battle tested your protocol against different threat scenarios, right? Like give it enough soak time, and during that time, it is a fair thing to expect that you actually have admin controls to be able to like pause the chain, to be able to like take some of these mitigation strategies that I recommend. So I would actually want to argue that it is not against decentralization at that point, because I would say like the survival is more important than decentralization. So that's how I think about it. Yes.
So great talk. And you said 3 great questions. Hopefully mine somewhat
Thank you. So the question that I have is, as the crypto community or the blockchain community looks at the community to participate and contribute in DePIN and things like that, right? You have extensions. For example, there's GRAST extension and others, right? Scraping AI data from individual nodes or computers, and then you are getting incentivized, by getting tokens. As a consumer or a user, besides the standard cyber hygiene security practices, how can we trust some of these protocols, and what can we do, in short, to not only support it, but protect ourselves?
I mean, there are two questions, right? Like one is basically trust and protect, right? Trust, you cannot. Protect, maybe you can, right? So the way I think about it is, essentially this boils down to like what sort of like wallet hygiene that you have. So one thing that I want to emphasize is, as institutions, we have the privilege of actually forcing the validators to run like specific, or basically to do like white label stuff, meaning that we have a stronger control on what services that they list and what services they don't, right? But unfortunately, this is not true for a lot of like retail end users, right? So where they can like level the playing field there is to essentially make sure that like anytime you interact with a given chain, if you don't know what that does, make sure that it is not, you actually separate your wallets completely on chain. And the second thing is also to make sure that you always do these practices like, okay, I do a test transaction and then a main transaction, right? So that kind of like helps you understand how that kind of like helps you understand how you're interacting with the chain. And the third thing that I always like, or at least I see a lot of our industry moving in the direction, is we want to be able to contextualize transactions, right? So even today, like one of the big unsolved problems is that when I work with my ops team, they are required to sign hashes. They don't know what that hash means, and I want the industry to pivot to be able to like contextualize these signatures and actually tell them like, this is what you're signing, here is how your balance changes, and this is the contract that you're interacting, right? So like I would say it's a combination of having good wallet hygiene and also the protocol. Like what can protocol teams do here is to make sure that when they ask for approvals, like practice the principle of least privilege, right? I have not seen a single protocol which has not said like, oh, approve maximum amount of funds, right? Like it's not necessary for them to do that. So practicing this like least privilege access both for protocols and for end users is going to help protect. So. All right, that's my time. Oh, sorry, there's one more question.
I was going to ask, what's your favorite hardware wallet and what's your favorite multi-sig protocol?
You're going to get me in trouble. So to be honest, what we do at Polychain that I'm comfortable sharing is we don't use hardware wallets. So what we do is essentially we have an air-gapped machine and the keys live there, and we sign transactions offline and then take the signature, decompose it, figure out like whether the parameters actually meet the function calls that we're making, right? So that is more for a high risk, or rather essentially for high risk institutions. But to answer your question, I've personally used Ledger a lot, but I'm not very excited after their, you know where I'm going with this. So the whole trust factor is that like once the keys are in your secure element, there is no way that you should be able to exfiltrate out, even as a feature. So.
And what about a multi-sig? Do you have a favorite protocol?
No. The reason is that like I feel multi-sig has a risk of key reconstitution. So there are way better cryptographic protocols which doesn't need to use multi-sig anymore. So things like encrypted MPC shares is like one example, right? So basically you split your seed phrase, you split your shards, encrypt it, and you're all set. So one last thing there is that the one other attack vector where I can think of where there is a problem is the implementation of crypto library itself. So we saw this in like Fireblocks basically demonstrated that a lot of like GG16 crypto library implementations were vulnerable for actually extracting signatures from on-chain and then reconstituting your private key shares. So that is the attack vector that we have to live with, I guess. Cool. Hey, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Abhi. Very great presentation.